My name is Jackson Harper. I have been working as a truck driver for over 20 years, driving thousands of miles in my truck across various states in America. My job is my pride, my freedom, and sometimes my curse. Roads can be different, sometimes quiet and deserted, other times dangerous and hostile. But there's one route I dare not take again, and it's about that route I want to tell you. It happened last autumn. I received an order to deliver cargo from Chicago to a small town called Blackwood, somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains. The order seemed ordinary, though Blackwood was just a small dot on the map. The cargo was nothing special, just a few containers with household items for local stores. I always preferred distant and deserted routes because I liked the peace and quiet they brought. I left Chicago early in the morning, aiming to cover most of the distance during the day. The day was warm and sunny, and the road was smooth. But as I approached the Appalachians, the sky turned gray and the air grew cold. A light rain began as I climbed the first hills, and it seemed to get more intense with each mile. Around 8 in the evening, I reached a small town called Asheville, where I stopped at a gas station. A local mechanic advised me not to go any further that night because of an approaching storm, but I decided to continue, hoping to avoid delays. The road became narrow, flanked by dense forests that seemed to lean toward me from both sides. As I approached a remote intersection, my GPS suddenly stopped working. It was as if someone had cut off the signal. I continued north, guided by an old map I always kept in my cab. The wind was picking up, and the rain turned into a real downpour. The truck started to skid on the wet road, and I decided to pull over to the side to wait out the storm. I sat in my cab listening to the rain pounding on the roof when I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. I hadn't seen a car for hours, so this surprised me. The lights were approaching quickly, and I saw an old pickup truck pull up next to me and stop. A man in a coat and hat, his face hidden in shadows, got out. "Good evening," he said, approaching my cab. "You must be lost." "No, I'm fine," I replied, trying to be polite but cautious, "just waiting for the storm to pass." "This is a dangerous road, especially at night," he said, looking straight into my eyes. "I'd advise you to turn back to Asheville." There was something unsettling in his gaze. I thanked him for the advice and said I'd consider it. He nodded and returned to his pickup, which quickly disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone again. I decided to heed his advice. I started the engine and began to turn the truck around on the narrow road. But then something strange happened. The truck's headlights illuminated a figure standing right in front of me on the road. It was a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face pale and gaunt. She was just standing there, staring at me. I slammed on the brakes, and the truck stopped just inches from her. She didn't move or show any emotion. I jumped out of the cab to ask if she was okay, but as I approached, she vanished. I looked around, but there was no trace of her anywhere. My heart was pounding, and I decided it was time to leave. But when I returned to the truck, I saw a message written on its side. In large, uneven letters it read, "Don't trust them." It was so strange that I felt a cold sweat break out. I quickly got into the cab and drove back to Asheville, trying to stay calm. The road seemed even more hostile, with the trees around me appearing to lean in, creating a tunnel. I made it back to the gas station in Asheville and went into the cafe, where the same mechanic was sitting. "You were right," I told him, sitting down next to him. "Something's not right on that road." He looked at me with serious eyes and silently nodded. "You're not the first to say that," he finally said. "Strange things have been happening there for a long time. People disappear. Strange figures appear. It's best to just avoid it." I decided to stay the night in Asheville. The next day, the storm had passed, and I found another route to Blackwood, which, although longer, seemed safer. When I reached Blackwood, the locals looked at me with a certain suspicion, as if they knew what I had been through. The cargo was delivered, but I never went back on that road again. And every time I drive near the Appalachians, I feel a chill run down my spine. That night, I realized that some things are better left unknown, and some roads are better avoided. Sometimes I think about that woman on the road and the message on the truck. What did it mean? Who can't be trusted? Maybe I'll never know. But one thing I do know for sure, that night I was closer to something otherworldly than ever before. I was behind the wheel of my truck, passing endless miles of a nighttime highway. My name is Jackson, but my friends call me Jack. I've been a truck driver for over 10 years, and in that time, I've seen a lot of strange things on the road. But what happened that night left me with nightmares for life. My task was simple: deliver a load from New York to Los Angeles. Not an easy mission, but I was used to long hauls. The truck was loaded with some electronic devices, and the main thing was to deliver them on time. It was around midnight when I noticed the first signs of trouble. The radio started to crackle, and although this was common in remote areas, it made me a bit nervous. I tried to ignore it, but when the radio finally died, I felt a strange unease. The road was empty, and the moon barely lit the highway. Suddenly, I saw a car on the side of the road ahead. It was old and looked abandoned. I didn't want to stop, but something about the sight made me hit the brakes. I got out of the cab, grabbed a flashlight, and headed towards the car. The door was open, and there was no one inside. On the seat lay a photograph, a family portrait. A man, a woman, and 2 children smiled from the paper frame. I felt a strange sense of loss, but didn't understand why. I decided to return to the truck when I heard a whisper. It was coming from the forest lining the highway. The whisper was quiet but clear. "Help us." My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't leave people in trouble. I took out my phone and dialed 911, but there was no signal. Deciding to take a risk, I grabbed the flashlight and headed into the forest. After walking for a few minutes, I came across an old house. It was abandoned, but it seemed that someone had recently been there. The door creaked as I opened it. A sense of fear washed over me from head to toe, but I still went inside. The house was dark, but I heard the same whispers. They sounded from everywhere. "Save us, Jack." How did they know my name? It didn't make sense. But I kept moving forward. In one of the rooms, I found children's toys and that same family portrait. My hands were trembling, but I picked up the portrait and felt something cold touch my shoulder. I turned around and saw a woman. She was pale like a ghost and looked at me with sadness in her eyes. "You must help us find peace," she said, her voice sounding like an echo from another world. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to control my fear. "We are trapped here. We died in a crash on that highway many years ago, but our souls can't find peace," she replied. I felt cold creeping into my bones. I didn't know what to do. But then she said, "Take our belongings to the crash site. It will help us move on." I took the photograph and a few other items she pointed to and returned to the truck. On the road, I felt like ghosts were following me, but I knew I had to do it. When I reached the crash site, I placed the items on the roadside. Suddenly, everything became quiet. I heard one last whisper. "Thank you, Jack." Returning to the truck, I felt that something had changed. I no longer heard the whispers, and the road ahead of me was clear. I continued my journey to Los Angeles, trying to forget that night. But every night when I hit the road again, I think about that family and hope that they finally found peace. This story became a reminder for me that not everything on this earth can be explained. Sometimes we have to face things beyond our understanding. And every time I see an abandoned car on the roadside, I remember that night and the ghosts I helped set free. My name is Michael. I have been working as a truck driver for over 10 years. The job is tough, but I like it because it gives me the opportunity to see the country and make good money. My day started as usual: coffee, checking the cargo, and preparing for a long trip. My cargo this time was special: antique furniture for a museum in New York. The responsibility was great, but I had handled similar tasks before, so I wasn't worried. I packed the cargo, checked the documents, and set off. The first 2 days of the journey passed without incident. The route took me through deserts and mountain passes. I enjoyed the scenery and listened to my favorite music. But on the third day, as I was driving through a lonely forest in Colorado, something strange happened. It was already night when I noticed the headlights on the side of the road. I thought it was another driver who had stopped for a rest. But when I got closer, I realized it was an old, abandoned car. It stood as if it had just been left in the middle of the road. I stopped to check if anyone needed help. I approached the car and saw that it was empty. But on the driver's seat lay a note with strange text. "Don't go any further, it's dangerous." I decided it was someone's joke or a warning about the poor road conditions, so I just drove on. But within a few miles, I began to notice that something was wrong. My truck suddenly started acting up. The engine stalled, the headlights flickered, and the radio began to have strange interference. Suddenly, I saw a figure on the road. It was a man dressed in old clothes, waving at me as if asking to stop. I decided to stop and see what was wrong. I approached him, but he was silent, just staring at me with his dark eyes. "What happened?" I asked. The man was silent, and then suddenly disappeared into thin air, as if he had never been there. I felt a chill down my spine, but decided it was just my imagination. I drove on, trying to forget about this strange incident. But nothing helped. At every turn, I was haunted by strange shadows, voices on the radio, and the feeling that someone was watching me. On the fourth day, I decided to stop in a small town for the night. I found a motel and checked in. But when I lay down to sleep, strange noises started coming from the hallway. I went out to check, but the hallway was empty. I returned to my room, but the noises didn't stop. Finally, I realized that this was more than just random coincidences. Something or someone was following me. In the morning, I came out of the motel and saw that my truck was completely wrecked. The windows were broken, the tires were slashed, and the cargo was gone. The police found no signs of a crime. They said it might have been the work of local vandals, but I knew it was something else. I decided to continue my journey, although without the cargo. I just wanted to get to New York and finish this terrible trip. On the way, I stopped in another small town. There, I met an old man who told me a scary legend about a local spirit that haunts those who pass through the forest. He said that this spirit was the soul of a truck driver who died many years ago and now takes revenge on everyone who dares to pass through his territory. I realized that this was my pursuer. I decided to return to that forest and try to deal with this spirit. I found the place where it all began and started shouting, "I know you're here. What do you want?" Suddenly, the same man who had disappeared earlier appeared. He approached me and said, "You must return what doesn't belong to you." I didn't understand what he was talking about. But then I remembered the cargo. The antique furniture I was carrying belonged to his family. He died trying to save these things during a fire. "I will return everything I can," I said. And suddenly, everything disappeared. I found myself on the side of the road. My truck was intact, and the cargo was in place. I drove to New York and delivered the cargo to the museum. After that incident, I realized that there are things we can't explain. But I will always remember that forest and the spirit that haunted me. This story taught me a lesson. Now I know that sometimes it's worth listening to warnings, even if they seem nonsensical. And although I continue to work as a truck driver, I always remember that night in the forest of Colorado.